There are stories that do not announce themselves as important when they begin. They do not arrive loudly or demand attention. They start quietly, almost invisibly, and only much later do you realize how much was at stake from the very first moment. This is one of those stories. It is the story of a man who, at the height of the Cold War, was personally chosen by President John F. Kennedy to be part of America's future in space. A man lifted up just long enough to see the stars within reach and then quietly set aside by forces he could not see and could not fight. What makes this story unsettling is not only what was promised, but how quickly that promise was taken away and how little explanation followed. Because for most people, this is where the story seems to end. Chosen, trained, and then rejected. But that is not the real shock here. The real shock is what came after. The decades of silence, the waiting, the life built in the shadow of something unfinished, and the moment when history, long after it had moved on, unexpectedly turned back. If you stay with this story, you will see exactly how that happens and why it matters far beyond rockets or politics. And as we begin, if you find yourself leaning in already, it helps more than you might think to quietly tap the like button. It tells me these slower, deeper stories are worth telling, and it helps them find the people who need them. Because what happened next was not loud, not dramatic, and not immediate. But something invisible had already started working against him, and once it did, nothing would ever unfold the way it was supposed to. Ed Dwight's story does not begin in a laboratory or on a runway. It begins much earlier, in Kansas City, Kansas, in a world where lessons were learned quietly and often without explanation. He grew up understanding order and discipline, not as abstract ideas, but as daily necessities. There were rules everywhere, some written down, others never spoken, and from a young age he learned which ones mattered most. He learned how to observe before acting, how to measure his words, how to stay composed even when circumstances felt unfair. These were not lessons taught in classrooms. They were absorbed through experience. He saw early on that effort did not always lead to opportunity, that doing everything right did not guarantee the same outcome for everyone. Still, he believed deeply in structure and responsibility. He believed that preparation mattered, that character was built through consistency, and that self-control was a form of strength. Those beliefs shaped him. They gave him stability in a world that often felt uneven, and while he could not have known it at the time, those early lessons, the quiet awareness, the restraint, the willingness to endure without complaint, would follow him into places far more demanding than his childhood ever was. Places where those same rules would resurface in ways he never expected. The Air Force gave Ed Dwight something he valued deeply: structure, clarity, and a standard that could be measured. When he joined, he did not see it as an escape or a statement. He saw it as a commitment. Training was demanding, but it was honest in a way that appealed to him. You either performed or you did not. He learned quickly, adapted fast, and earned his place through discipline rather than bravado. As a pilot, he stood out not because he talked the loudest or took unnecessary risks, but because he was precise. He respected procedures. He stayed calm under pressure. He flew the aircraft exactly as it was meant to be flown. In environments where confidence often bordered on recklessness, his control became his signature. Instructors noticed. Fellow pilots trusted him. His reputation grew quietly, built on consistency rather than spectacle. For a time, it felt like he had found a system where performance truly mattered, where effort and ability aligned. And it was that reputation, solid and unquestioned, that eventually placed his name on a list that very few pilots ever see, a list that would send him to a place where everything he believed about fairness, performance, and opportunity would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. By the early 1960s, the world felt smaller and more dangerous at the same time. The Cold War had turned science into competition and space into a battlefield without weapons. When the Soviet Union sent a man into orbit, it struck a nerve deep inside American leadership. Space was no longer about exploration alone. It was about credibility, influence, and the future. President John F. Kennedy understood that better than anyone. He knew that who America sent into space mattered just as much as the technology that got them there. Behind closed doors, he issued a directive that quietly changed lives. The United States would identify and prepare a black astronaut candidate, not as a gesture, but as a statement to the world about who belonged in the future America claimed to represent. That decision moved quickly through the chain of command, and when it reached the Air Force, one name rose naturally to the surface: Ed Dwight. His record spoke for itself. His discipline was unquestioned. He was selected for advanced training at Edwards Air Force Base, the proving ground for the most elite pilots in the country. On paper, history had just opened a door that had never truly been opened before. But doors like that, once opened, do not always stay open, and being chosen, as Ed Dwight was about to learn, did not mean being protected once you stepped inside. Edwards Air Force Base was unlike any place Ed Dwight had ever known, and from the moment he arrived, he could feel that the rules were different there, even if no one explained how. This was where confidence was stripped down to its core, where pilots were pushed beyond what they believed were their limits, and where mistakes were remembered long after they were made. The days were relentless, filled with briefings that left no room for error and flights that demanded total concentration, and the nights offered little relief because evaluation never truly stopped. Every movement, every decision, every reaction was being watched, measured, and quietly compared. For many pilots, the pressure came from the difficulty alone. For Dwight, there was something more, something harder to name. Feedback arrived unevenly. Praise was brief and rare. Criticism lingered without clear direction. Small errors that others were allowed to recover from seemed to follow him longer, hanging in the air as unspoken questions. No one ever told him outright that he did not belong, but no one reassured him that he did either. That uncertainty settled into him slowly, forcing him to become even more controlled, even more careful, even more restrained. He spoke less, listened more, and worked harder, believing that excellence would eventually cut through whatever invisible barrier he was facing. Outside the base, newspapers were already calling him a future astronaut, a symbol of progress, proof that history was finally turning a corner. Inside Edwards, the atmosphere felt colder, quieter, and far less certain. And as the weeks passed, Ed Dwight began to sense something deeply unsettling, that while he was being tested like everyone else, the consequences of those tests were not being weighed the same way, and that realization, still unspoken and unresolved, was about to collide with events far beyond his control. Outside the gates of Edwards, the story of Ed Dwight was being told in a way he barely recognized. Newspapers spoke of progress. Headlines hinted that America was on the verge of something historic. Photographs showed a confident pilot, a symbol of a nation trying to reconcile its future with its ideals. To the public, it already felt decided. The first black astronaut seemed inevitable, and that contrast created a pressure Dwight never asked for. Inside the base, he was navigating silence, uncertainty, and constantly shifting expectations. Outside, the world believed the outcome was already written. That gap between perception and reality widened with every passing week. People congratulated him for milestones he had not yet reached. Reporters framed his presence as proof that barriers were falling. But none of them saw the closed doors, the unreturned conversations, the quiet sense that momentum was slipping away. Dwight carried that weight alone, knowing that if the story collapsed, it would not collapse in public. It would collapse quietly, behind closed doors, without explanation. And as the headlines grew more confident, the atmosphere around him grew colder, setting the stage for a turning point that would arrive suddenly and leave no room to prepare. In November of 1963, the world stopped in a way that is difficult to describe unless you lived through it. The news moved fast, faster than understanding could keep up, and by the time the shock settled, President John F. Kennedy was gone. For the country, it was a moment of grief and disbelief. For Ed Dwight, it was also something else, something quieter and far more personal. Almost overnight, the tone around him changed. Conversations that once carried urgency fell silent. Plans that had felt fragile but real were no longer mentioned at all. The political will that had placed him at Edwards, the unseen hand that had opened the door in the first place, vanished without ceremony. No one explained what this meant for him. No one needed to. He could feel it in the sudden distance, in the way eyes no longer lingered, in how momentum simply drained away. There was no dramatic dismissal, no clear rejection to argue against. The future he had been training for did not collapse in flames. It faded. It slipped quietly out of reach, leaving behind a silence so complete that it was impossible to tell where the story had truly ended. And that silence, more than anything else, was about to follow him for the rest of his life. When the final decision came, it did not arrive with a meeting or a statement or even a sentence that could be argued against. Ed Dwight was simply not selected. There was no explanation offered, no official reason given, no moment where someone sat across from him and told him what he had done wrong or what he could have done differently. One day, he was training for a future that felt just within reach, and the next day, that future no longer existed. That kind of ending leaves a particular mark on a person because it offers no closure. It forces you to carry unanswered questions forward, to replay moments in your mind without ever knowing which one mattered most. For Dwight, the weight was not only professional, it was deeply personal. He had been asked to imagine a future, to shape his life around it, and then to quietly let it go without understanding why. That uncertainty lingered, pressing on him in moments of stillness, making it difficult to fully grieve or fully move on. Eventually, he faced a decision of his own. He could remain inside a system that had already turned its attention elsewhere, waiting for an explanation that might never come, or he could step away and reclaim control over his life in another direction. Choosing to walk away did not feel like defeat, but it did feel unfinished, and I often find myself wondering what choice I would have made in his place, Whether I would have stayed and waited or closed the door myself and started again somewhere else. If you have ever faced a moment like that, I would genuinely like to know what you think you would have done, because what comes next in Ed Dwight's life was shaped entirely by that quiet, irreversible choice. Walking away from aviation meant walking away from an identity Ed Dwight had spent years building. Flying had given his life structure, clarity, and purpose, and leaving it behind was not something he did lightly. There was no ceremony to mark that transition, no public acknowledgement of what he was giving up. He simply stepped out of the uniform and into a future that had not been planned. At first, he turned his discipline toward business, applying the same focus and restraint that had once kept him steady in the air. He built, invested, learned, and adapted, creating stability where uncertainty had taken root. But something inside him still needed expression, something that could not be resolved through numbers or contracts. Over time, he found that outlet in sculpture. Working with bronze and stone, he began telling stories that words never quite captured, stories of struggle, dignity, history, and endurance. His art was not loud or confrontational. It did not demand attention. It invited reflection. Through it, he chose dignity over protest, creation over complaint. And while this second life brought recognition and respect, it never fully erased the unanswered question that lingered beneath the surface. Time moved forward, decades passed, and the world changed around him. Yet the story that had been interrupted all those years ago remained unfinished, quietly waiting for a moment no one could have predicted. For most people, stories like this end quietly, somewhere in the past, with no return and no correction. And for a long time, Ed Dwight believed his had ended that way too. But the world of spaceflight was changing again, this time in a direction no one in the 1960s could have imagined. Private companies entered the field, rewriting the rules of who could fly and why. Space was no longer reserved only for government programs or Cold War symbolism. It became in some ways more human. And then one day, the call came. An invitation from Blue Origin, offering Ed Dwight the chance to finally leave Earth. By then, he was nearly 90 years old. He had lived a full life, built success, found purpose beyond the dream that once defined him. He did not respond impulsively. He reflected. He thought about the years of silence, the door that had closed without explanation, and the life he had built in its absence. He asked himself what this moment really meant. Was it redemption, a correction of something that should never have happened, or was it simply closure, a chance to finish a story on his own terms? As the launch date approached, that question lingered because the answer would not come until the very last moment, one that would quietly reframe everything that had come before. On the day of the launch, there was no spectacle in Ed Dwight's voice, no sense of victory being claimed or wrongs being loudly corrected. As the spacecraft prepared to lift, the moment felt almost understated, as if it understood the weight it carried and chose restraint instead. When the engines ignited and the ground fell away, decades collapsed into seconds. The earth grew smaller beneath him, familiar and distant all at once. At 90 years old, Ed Dwight became the oldest American ever to travel into space, a record that spoke for itself without needing to be announced. Looking down at the planet, there was no anger in him, no bitterness waiting to be released. There was perspective, the kind that only comes from having lived long enough to see promises broken and lives rebuilt without them. This was not a moment of triumph in the way people expect triumph to look. It was quieter than that. It was completion. A long, open loop finally closing, not with celebration, but with calm understanding. And as the spacecraft began its return, one final question remained hanging in the air, not about space or history, but about what this moment truly meant for a life that had waited so long to arrive here. When I think about Ed Dwight's story, what stays with me is not the rocket or the record or even the moment he finally left Earth. What stays with me is the patience it took to live a full life without knowing whether the story would ever circle back. It is the dignity of carrying disappointment without letting it harden into bitterness. History, when it corrects itself, rarely does so quickly. It moves slowly, unevenly, sometimes leaving people behind for far too long before it realizes what it has missed. Ed Dwight paid that cost. He waited through silence, through decades where the world moved on and forgot his name, and he built something meaningful anyway. And when the moment finally came, it did not feel like revenge or victory. It felt like quiet justice, the kind that does not announce itself, but settles gently where it belongs. Stories like this remind us that a life cannot be reduced to a single door opening or closing, and that fulfillment does not always arrive on the schedule we expect. If this story stayed with you, and if you want to hear more like it, I hope you will subscribe so we can continue this journey together. And if there is a story you believe deserves this kind of careful, unhurried telling, one shaped by patience and honesty, leave it in the comments. Sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that waited the longest to be heard.